The sky over Cape Canaveral was crystalline that morning, a rare, brittle blue that seemed to stretch endlessly across the Florida coast. It was January 28th, 1986. A biting chill clung to the air, unusual for the region, but the cold didn't deter the thousands gathered at the Kennedy Space Center, nor the millions tuned in across the country. Children in classrooms, parents at breakfast tables, engineers gripping the rails in mission control. All eyes were on the launch pad. The Space Shuttle Challenger stood tall, steam coiling from its flanks, bathed in golden morning light. Inside the orbiter, 7 astronauts waited, 6 professionals and 1 civilian, a schoolteacher named Krista McAuliffe. She'd become a national icon, the first private citizen in space. She'd promised to bring the stars to her students, to teach a lesson from orbit. Her smile had graced every television screen in America. Her presence made this more than a launch. It was a symbol of hope, of progress, of trust in a system that had never failed so publicly before. The countdown was routine. T-10, 9, 8, ignition sequence start. The engines flared, rumbling like a storm beneath the earth. Ice cracked from the shuttle's frame as it roared to life. Challenger rose, blazing into the morning sky, white exhaust carving a luminous arc above the Atlantic. 73 seconds later, it disappeared in a sudden bloom of fire. At first, no one understood what they were seeing. The contrail forked strangely. There was no explosion sound on the live feed, just stunned silence. Then, Mission Control's voice, flat and unbelieving. Obviously, a major malfunction. In classrooms across the country, children screamed. In living rooms, cups fell from hands. At the launch site, family members clutched one another in horror. The shuttle was gone. The crew was gone. All that remained was a curling, cloud-white Y in the sky, and the dreadful realization that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The Challenger disaster would become one of the most haunting failures in American technological history. Not because it was unpredictable, but because it wasn't. The warning signs had been there. People had tried to stop it, but the system, the very institution tasked with protecting lives, had ignored them. Behind the scenes, panic ignited instantly. Telemetry vanished. Radar screens showed debris falling into the sea. But even before the wreckage hit the ocean, NASA officials began preparing statements, spinning narratives. They called it a tragedy, a freak accident, an unforeseeable flaw. But engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, knew better. Some of them had been warning about this exact scenario for months. The night before the launch, they had begged NASA to delay. The shuttle's boosters were connected by large rubber O-rings, critical seals designed to prevent hot gases from escaping during launch. On that frigid morning, temperatures had dropped into the 20s. Ice coated the launch pad. Morton Thiokol's engineers, especially Roger Boisjoli, had sounded alarms for months. Cold weather compromised the O-rings. They could fail. And if they did, hot gases would breach the seal, burn through the fuel tank, and destroy the shuttle. That night, Boisjoli and his colleagues made their case in a tense teleconference. The data was clear. They urged NASA to postpone. But managers, pressured by political deadlines and public expectations, pushed back. Delaying the launch would embarrass the agency. After all, the Challenger mission had already been delayed several times. Now, the world was watching. So the engineers were overruled. Morton Thiokol's senior leadership reversed their recommendation. The launch would proceed. The next morning, as ice glistened on the shuttle's hull, no one mentioned the O-rings. No warnings were given. The astronauts climbed aboard, unaware that they were stepping into a machine doomed to fail. The final moments were routine. 35 seconds into flight, Challenger experienced the strongest wind shear in shuttle history, but the guidance system compensated. Everything looked nominal. But just 1 second after liftoff, hot gas had begun leaking through a damaged O-ring on the right booster. It was subtle at first, invisible to the eye. By the time the shuttle reached 46,000 feet, that flame had burned into the external fuel tank. At 73 seconds, the tank ruptured. The hydrogen and oxygen inside ignited instantly. The Challenger disintegrated in midair. NASA insisted the crew had died instantly, but later analysis suggested otherwise. The crew cabin, pressurized and intact, had separated from the explosion and continued rising before falling back into the ocean. The forces were extreme, but survivable. For over 2 minutes, that cabin plummeted. In the darkness of free fall, at least some crew members likely remained conscious, strapped into their seats, aware of what was happening. One emergency oxygen system had been activated. Evidence suggested that pilot Mike Smith may have reached for switches during descent. They knew. The impact with the ocean was catastrophic, equivalent to hitting concrete at over 200 miles per hour. The cabin shattered. There were no survivors. In the aftermath, America mourned. President Reagan addressed the nation, quoting the poet John Magee. They slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. But behind the solemn speeches, a different truth was unfolding. The Rogers Commission, an investigative panel led by former Secretary of State William Rogers and including physicist Richard Feynman, uncovered a litany of systemic failures. Feynman, skeptical of NASA's culture, performed a simple demonstration on national television. He dipped an O-ring into a glass of ice water, pulled it out, and showed how stiff it had become. For a successful technology, he said, reality must take precedence over public relations. The Commission's findings were damning. NASA had accepted flaws as normal. Engineers' concerns were minimized or ignored. A pattern of organizational complacency had taken root. Managers gambled with lives to maintain schedules. The warning signs were clear, but no one in power had listened. Roger Boisjoli, devastated by the outcome, would later testify before Congress. His voice shook as he recalled the ignored warnings, the desperate attempts to stop the launch. He said he felt like he had watched his friends be murdered in slow motion. The tragedy changed NASA forever. The shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years. Major design overhauls were made. Internal communication protocols were restructured, but some scars never healed. Krista McAuliffe left behind 2 young children, pilot Michael Smith, Commander Dick Scobie, mission specialists Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair. All had families. All had trusted the system. All had believed in the mission. Their remains were recovered from the Atlantic weeks later, sealed in caskets, draped with flags. In the years since, Challenger has become a symbol of bravery, of sacrifice, and of institutional failure. It reminds us that systems, no matter how advanced, are only as strong as the people who run them. That pride can blind us, that deadlines can kill. That real accountability only comes when we face the truth, however uncomfortable. The Challenger 7 were heroes, but they shouldn't have died. They weren't lost to the mysteries of space. They were lost to the silence of ignored warnings. They were lost to a system that failed, while people paid the price. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.